Here's a story that might surprise you. Bru, the most feared commando of his age, who could outfox British generals in the veldt, and later sit, calm as a copy at sunrise, in the nerve center of an empire at war, wasn't driven by whiskey, medals, or the roar of parades. He was drawn, again and again, to quiet rooms where women settled him with tea and straight talk, to handwritten letters that smelt faintly of lavender and dust, to a farmhouse where a woman he called Icy ran the household like a small republic, and to the unshowy patience of a mother who taught him to read the Bible and the wind at the same time. People call him a statesman, a general, a philosopher. But if you really want to understand Jan Christiaan Smuts, South African Prime Minister, maker and breaker of wars, you have to step into the women's spaces around him, and listen for the creak of a stoop chair where the most decisive conversations of his life took place. No tabloid fireworks here, my China. The intrigue, as you'll hear, is subtler. It's the way a man can be steered by tenderness, steadied by partnership, challenged by fierce intellect, and exposed, sometimes painfully, by women who refuse to let his grand ideas gloss over human cost. He comes into focus first as a boy, bare feet dusty, racing the wind on his family's wheat and wine farm near Riebeek West in the Cape, 1870s. The house is austere, the language Dutch Afrikaans, the days ordered by scripture and seasons. His mother, Catharina Petronella de Vries, stern, practical, possessed of that farm woman power to turn scarcity into supper, anchors the home after his father's early death. From her he learns a rhythm that never quite leaves him: wait before dawn, work until the job is done, respect silence, weigh words. But there's something else lodged in him by the women's sphere of the farmhouse, the emotional economy of attentiveness. A glance can be a command. A raised eyebrow is a verdict. And when you've watched a mother balance a ledger of rain, grain, and prayer, you begin to understand that leadership, at its core, is domestic. You count, you plan, and you try keep the little ones warm. It's not soft living. He grows up thin as a whip and twice as stubborn, schooling first at Riebeek West, then at Victoria College in Stellenbosch, where books become both weapon and refuge. Picture him there, the young man with eyes that miss nothing, a pocketbook of notes, shoulders already set like he's carrying history under his jacket. At 21 he ships out to Cambridge, yes, that Cambridge, where he eats philosophy like biltong, tough and nourishing. He learns the austere joys of logic, the sparkle of metaphysics, the rope bridge between ideas and power. But even in England, the voices that ring truest for him are the letters from home, the firm, looping hand of his fiancée, Sibella Margaretha Craig, Icy, and the steadying domestic news that reminds him what all this battle at books is ultimately for. He is not a dandy, he is a farm boy gloved in Latin and Greek. Those letters are practical, affectionate, and without fuss. Icy is not dazzled by Cambridge, she wants to know what sort of husband Jan means to be, and what sort of home they will make. It's there, between ambitions that could swallow continents and a woman's calm question about firewood, that the line of his life is chalked. The return to the Cape feels like a wave turning back into itself. The law tempts him, politics seduces him, the storm of the South African War breaks over him. The young advocate with the scholar's brow becomes a commander-leader, stitched into the veldt with those small, hard columns that could vanish into merely fields and then bite you from the thornbush. He learns to live on a handful of mealies and an idea. He learns to lead men who respect results, not rhetoric. And in this crucible, there is a woman's counterpart narrative unfolding across the scorched earth, the concentration camps for Boer women and children, the smoky kitchens of makeshift lagers, the letters carried under skirts and in hymnbooks, the quiet heroism of a people surviving on scraps and stubbornness. It's not a romantic canvas, friend. But it's vital, because this war burns into Smuts a lifelong awareness that the fate of nations is often decided in kitchens, and that the cost of strategy is borne, first and last, by women. Enter two presences who will haunt his conscience in different registers. One is Emily Hobhouse, the British activist who exposes the camps and shames the empire with her facts and her ferocious compassion. She is not his lover, she is something more dangerous to a soldier, his moral witness. When she writes, the air around him gets colder. War, she reminds him, is not a chessboard. Each move is a child's fever, a mother's grave, a winter without shoes. The other presence is Olive Schreiner, South Africa's great prophetic voice, a writer whose mind crackles with insight and contradiction. She, too, is no romantic entanglement, she is a walking interrogation of power. Schreiner admires the bigness in him, the capacity to dream a federation, a peace, a framework that outlives bullets, but she loathes the compromises he keeps with empire and race. If you listen closely, you can hear the timbre of those conversations, Schreiner's voice like flint, striking sparks off his polished sentences. Smuts, a strategist of nations, discovered in the dock of a woman's relentless moral logic. In those rooms, his famous composure looks less like granite and more like a man trying to square two truths, that order is precious, and that justice is hungry. Meanwhile, there is the home front, Icy. They marry in the 1890s, and from the start their marriage is partnership, not pageant. At Dornkloof, the farm near Irene, she runs the house and the gardens and the endless stream of guests, diplomats, soldiers, scholars, who come hoping to pry a decision out of the master, and leave having been quietly converted by the mistress's coffee, tact, and unflappable calm. The English learn to pronounce her nickname with respect. The Afrikaners call her Uma with a fondness that carries steel. She is pious without priggishness, thrifty without meanness, and a political realist who never courted the limelight. When the men shout in Parliament, she's the one turning chaos into supper. When the newspapers hail General Smuts, she's tallying accounts and seeing that the workers are paid. And in the evenings, when Jan's brow is furrowed with the kind of sums that involve borders, budgets, and blood, she sits beside him and slowly brings the human scale back into the room. This is not the stuff of scandal. It's the architecture of a life that can survive the altitude of power. Don't get me wrong, the world will always try to write a spicier script. Imagine the rumour mill of early 20th century Cape Town and Pretoria, the salons buzzing, the empire's socialites fluttering around. The handsome, unsmiling general who quotes Plato. But the archives are stubbornly unsexy on this point. If you came looking for lovers behind latticed windows and secrets stuffed into blue envelopes, you'll find instead a quieter tension. A man stretched between duty and intimacy, between an ideal of unity and the intimate insurgencies of those who insisted he see the faces inside his equations. The intrigues in Smuts's life are often political, and the women in them are not pawns but auditors. Hobhouse, with her iron compassion, asks for receipts on civilian suffering. Schreiner, with her prophetic scorn, demands a balance sheet on justice. Icy, with her domestic statecraft, checks the cash flow of calories and care. And then there's another womanly force we tend to miss in the biographies, the land itself, feminized in the old idiom, built as mother. Mountain as guardian, teaching him in grasses and granite what, holism, will later become in his philosophy. Picture a morning at Dornkloof. The wind comes thin off the highvold, the aloes stand like sentries, and Smuts is up before the sun with a botany tin and a lunch parcel wrapped in clean cloth. He walks alone, then with a companion, then alone again, collecting plants, thinking about patterns. Here is one of the most arresting images of him, the scholar warrior in a felt hat, kneeling to examine a sprig of veld flower with a tenderness that would surprise those who only knew the general on a horse. He will write, in time, Holism and Evolution, a book whose main argument, everything is part of a larger, self-organizing whole, feels like a love letter to the veld as much as a theory of politics. And if you look for the feminine in his imagination, you'll find it here, not in gossip, but in metaphor. The nation as organism, society as a living tissue, power as a gardener's art, coaxing growth, not hammering it into place. It's easy to mock that language. Yet it's in this scene between science and sentiment that his public life catches fire again. World War I drags him across the hemispheres, into the Imperial War Cabinet in London. He sits at that polished table with men who carry the world in their briefcases. He brings, oddly enough, the veld with him. He talks about unity like it's a crop you can ruin if you overwater. He argues for a League of Nations, imperfect, aspirational, maddening, and you can hear echoes of those stoop conversations in Irene. Institutions, like households, must be constructed to absorb shocks. In London salons, women of rank and talent test him with an amused curiosity, this barefoot philosopher from the colonies, with his neat sentences and his unsettling calm. There are flattering portraits, to be sure, society writers who find him interesting in the way a thunderstorm is interesting, but very little in the way of scandal. His heart is already committed, to a wife who does not flirt, to a home that does not perform, and to an idea of service that leaves no emotional oxygen for side quests. Still, there is friction. On the question of women's political rights, Smuts carries the caution of his class and time. He does not become a suffragette poster boy. His instinct is evolutionary, adapt society without breaking its back. That puts him behind bolder women, and some men, who see the vote not as a tweak but as a moral debt long overdue. He is nudged forward by realities more than manifestos, by women running wartime relief, by their competence in the public square, by their relentless visibility in rebuilding what war and recession break. And at home, ICE's authority is a daily referendum on the notion that women are somehow unsuited to the work of governance. She governs every day, thank you very much. When, in 1930, South Africa grants the vote to white women, ICE is at the hub of female civic networks that made that vote count. Critics will say, fairly, that the franchise extends along racial lines that cut the nation. Admirers will say, also fairly, that a door opened because women pushed and men like Smuts finally stopped bracing it with their heels. Now, if you want an intrigue stamped with heartbreak rather than heat, look to the war years again, this time World War II, when the domestic realm becomes a front line. ICE organizes parcels for soldiers, marshals women's committees, keeps morale alive with the kind of logistics no parade ever honors. The Smuts household becomes a hub of typed lists, sealed boxes, and hard, bright smiles. In those years, Jan's daily bread is tension, the Allied cause, the Afrikaner split at home, the threat of sabotage, the knowledge that every telegram could be bad news for some mother. He is, by then, older, his hair gone to that silver that cameras love, but his eyes are still those steady dark coals. And behind the scenes, the same quiet domestic government continues, a wife keeping the engine oiled, a network of women turning volunteerism into policy by sheer persistence, a prime minister who comes home to the one person who can tell him, without fear or flattery, that he is wrong. Let's pause the camera on a small, arresting moment. A guest at Dawncliffe recalls ICE moving through a crowded room, stacking empty cups, catching a dropped spoon before it hits the floor, leaning down to murmur to the cook, and then pausing to place her hand lightly on Jan's shoulder as he speaks to a visiting dignitary. It's half a second, a domestic semaphore, I'm here. Finish soon. You've got a call waiting. He doesn't look up, of course he doesn't, he's mid-sentence, but his shoulders settle a fraction. That's marriage as choreography. That's power negotiated in touch and tea, not decrees. You want to talk about relationships with women? Start there, with the art of two lives braided so tightly that a room full of power barely notices the most important conversation in it. There's a shadow in this story, and it's not a secret mistress or a love child tucked into a boarding house ledger. It's the racial contradiction that women like Schreiner kept thrusting in his face. How can you preach unity and deny it to millions? And yes, you must name ICE's world, comfortable and efficient, as part of that contradiction, sustained by a racial order that kept other women cleaning in the background, their names unrecorded, their voices unheard in the salons. If the women around Smuts are to be honored properly, the picture must widen to include those whose labor under the grace of Dawncliffe, cooks, nannies, gardeners' wives, laundry women, who carried water and memory, who watched the great man come and go and measured leadership not by speeches but by the groceries delivered to their back doors. No scandal column will ever list them. But if you want to feel the moral current that kept tugging at Smuts's coat, tugging him toward a broader conception of justice he never fully reached, listen for those unheard women. Their silence is the loudest thing in the room. By the late 1940s, the political weather turns. The National Party rides resentment like a wild horse. Smuts, architect of international order, finds himself outflanked at home. He loses in 1948. The shock is real. There's a photograph, Jan walking through a crowd, hat in his hand, the granite of his profile softened by something like relief, or perhaps simply fatigue. At Dawnkloof that evening, the lamps are lit early, the tea poured a touch stronger. Icy moves through the rooms with the same unhurried competence as always. What do you do when history closes a door you thought you'd built to last? If you're these two, you do what you've always done, sit together, speak plainly, plan the next day's work. If there's an affair in this house, it's the lifelong affair with service, sometimes wise, sometimes blinkered, often costly, always sincere. And so the story resolves not in fireworks but in the shifting colors of the hivelled sky. Smuts dies in 1950, the farm rolling out in bruised greens and browns, the aloes bristling against the wind. The women's chorus that framed his life does not fall silent, Icy carries on, the networks of female civic labor hum, the critics keep asking the right hard questions, and the land, forever that quiet mother in his imagination, goes on teaching those who will listen. If you came hunting scandal, you've been ambushed by something rarer, a public man whose most intimate intrigues were intellectual and domestic, whose most decisive partners were women who refused to be scenery, whose legacy, contested, luminous, flawed, makes more sense when you follow, cup by cup, list by list, letter by letter, the women who kept his world honest. You asked for the next stretch, and here's the hook to pull you in, brew, forget the medals, the parliamentary thunder, the world leaders in morning coats. Picture instead a small wooden table at Dawnkloof, a chipped sugar bowl between two cups, and a silence so charged it could set dry veldt alight. On one side, the woman who knows where every sock, ledger, and secret sits in this household. On the other, the man who can quote Aristotle while drafting orders that move battalions like chessmen. Watch carefully, the steam from the tea lifts, a moth bumps the paraffin lamp, and in that quiet Icy says just 6 plain words that change the day's campaign. Jan, that won't feed the workers. No fanfare. No argument. Just an adjustment of reality. This is the kind of intrigue that actually tilts history, a private correction with public consequences, a domestic veto that never makes the newspapers. If you listen for scandal, you'll miss it. If you listen for truth, you'll hear a nation being remeasured to fit human beings. Before that stoop scene there is courtship, and courtship begins with noticing. In Stellenbosch here's the quiet oak with the eyes that take the room's measure before he sits down. He dresses neat but plain, shoulders stooped a touch from study, speaking only when it counts. She, Sibella, Icy, Crige, moves like purpose in a skirt, quick, alert, the kind of person who can make a meal and a plan from the same basket of odds and ends. The letters between them, no scandal there, don't worry, but a great deal of signal, lay out the terms of alliance, she wants a husband. He'll be a whole person, not a statue, he wants a home that won't buckle under the weight of ambition. They bargain, lightly and then seriously, over the rhythm of Sundays, the stewardship of money, the number of guests a week the kitchen can bear. I don't want to be ornamental, she writes in the practical idiom of the day. Help me build. He answers with a promise as audacious as any campaign brief, to make a life where thinking and doing share the same table. Then the war comes, and with it the long test of those vows. The images the camera loves are all male, dust, horses, cold dawns, the lean-eyed commandos melting into blue gums and copies. But parallel to that, and no less fierce, runs the women's war, recipes stretched thin as paper, children's coughs counted through the night, messages sewn into hems, a new hardness in women's voices when men try to soft-soap them with patriotic nonsense. Icy's realm is logistics, a ration summed like an equation, a herd saved from raiders because somebody bothered to fix a gate the night before. Smuts writes orders, she writes lists. Each list is a small stand against chaos. Each order is a bet that the list will still be possible tomorrow. When he sneaks a day at home, the horse in a lather at the gate, the dog a blur, the children an explosion, Icy folds him into the ordinary with the skill of a field nurse pushing a bone back into place. Eat, wash, sleep. Tomorrow you can be a hero, she says, and he obeys because in that room heroism is a dish to be served after the porridge is finished. You want drama? Try this, the letter arrives, an Englishwoman's reports of the camps, the numbers too raw to be played for politics. Emily Hobhouse's prose is surgical, not shrill, and it slices through every man's habit of euphemism. Smuts reads, and the room changes temperature. War is suddenly not a map. It is a woman wrapping a child's feet in torn skirts. It is a hunger that sits like a small, implacable god in the middle of a tent and demands offerings 3 times a day. Icy reads over his shoulder, quietly. We're not special, she says after a time. Suffering isn't patriotic. It's just suffering. No rebuke, just reality. Later, when the speeches resume and the tidy phrases return, he will carry that cold through the words like a draft through a church. If you're looking for a lover to complicate Smuts's world, here's a harder truth: the women who complicate him do it with witness, not romance. Hobhouse demands receipts. Icy insists on groceries. The romance is with the possible, not with a person, and that is somehow both less sensational and more dangerous. Olive Schreiner enters like a thunderstorm on a hot afternoon, cracking the air and making the dust dance. She has no patience for male cleverness polished to a shine. She brings parables and knives, all in the same paragraph. The conversations between Schreiner and Smuts, some in person, some by letter, feel like fencing bouts where both fencers are trying to cut their way out of the same burning house. She admires the reach of his mind, how he can stand on a hill and see a whole federation of problems like a flock moving across sky. She is furious at the blind spots that come bundled with that altitude, how easily order becomes an alibi for not yet when justice knocks. The emotional voltage in those exchanges is not erotic, it is moral. Schreiner refuses to let him call prudent what is, too often, fear of breaking the china. He refuses to allow her to collapse statecraft into slogans. In that friction, sparks land in dry grass, and some of them burn long after both are gone. Now back to the farmhouse, because that is the scene of the long intrigue, a marriage that took the measure of power daily. Dorncliffe is not Versailles, it's a working place, a bell that summons, a pantry that tells the truth, a yard with a dozen jobs waiting before breakfast. Yet the guest book reads like a pocket atlas. Diplomats, generals, scientists with spectacles that look like field glasses, and, often, women who carry their own revolutions quietly, organizers, fundraisers, nurses who have learned the exact weight of a man who has lost too much blood. Icy runs that flow like a harbor master. She places the awkward next to the forgiving, she supplies a cushion to an old enemy's back that says, without words, we're civil here, behave. And all the while she is translating power into human terms. That policy you like, Jan? The one with the neat lines? It needs a kitchen. He smiles, half ironically. Everything needs a kitchen, he says. J.A., she answers, but not everyone remembers that before lunch. Their quarrels, because of course there are quarrels, are weather, not climate. She hates waste, he hates pettiness. Sometimes that makes sparks. He comes home fuming at a colleague who has gone small when the moment called for size. She listens, nods, and then asks, what is the size of a loaf? The question punctures the balloon. He laughs despite himself, and the tension drains into talk. On rare nights the quarrel is sharper, when he's tired and pompous. Yes, it happened, no one survives that many meetings without catching pompousness like a winter cold, she will quietly say, you're not listening, and walk out to the vegetable garden to think. He waits. He goes to the doorway, hat in hand, the veldt beyond going black blue. I'm listening now, he says, and the marriage resets like a compass. From the farm the story loops out to London, to cabinet rooms where carpets suck the sound from your feet and the windows are tall enough to make a man feel child-sized. In that world Smuts is a strange exhibit, the South African with a scholar's brow, talking about unity in a tone you might use to discuss weather patterns. Society women notice him, of course they do, novelty sells. But he's a difficult poster boy for a salon. He's courteous to a fault, allergic to flirtation, and endearingly literal when someone tries a clever tease. He's invulnerable to the kind of glamour that works on men who need affirmations from strangers. Why? Because he has a permanent audience of one who is not impressed by charm. A woman who will, if he gets too pleased with his own sentences, hand him a basket and say, "The hens are off lay. Buy eggs." It is hard to sustain delusions of grandeur while comparing prices at the Irene Co-op. There is another women's chorus humming at the edges of the public story, relief committees, school boards, church bazaars that are actually political machines in aprons. During the influenza pandemic, during droughts, during those lean years when the farm's books don't quite add up, it is women who stitch the holes closed. Icy is everywhere and nowhere. You can't pin the map with pins because the work moves faster than the cartographer. She writes to women across the country, swaps recipes and minutes, organizes a shipment of blankets like a general marshal's a flanking maneuver. The myth says men built the nation, the ledger says women kept it from falling apart between paydays. And now for the kind of moment that the tabloids would twist if they could, but which resists their sugar, a garden party at Dorncliffe, wartime. The lawn's a bit ragged, flowers soldier on despite wind, uniforms flash like fish in sunlight. Smuts is telling a story, something about a council meeting in London where everybody spoke and nothing was said, when a messenger arrives. Cheeks bright, eyes too wide. The paper in his hand is one of those telegrams that freeze an afternoon. Icy is 3 steps away with a plate of lamingtons. She reads the boy's face before anyone else does. She puts the plate down, touches Jan's sleeve, takes the telegram, and directs a chair into the shade with a flick of the wrist. They read the news together, shoulders touching, and then she moves, tea to the widow, a whisper to the chaplain, a signal to the kitchen to start soup. Smuts squares his shoulders, finds words that do not lie, and says them. That's how they do it, one holds the world while the other picks up the pieces people actually bleed on. On the question of women's formal power, Smuts is no revolutionary. He is cautious, evolutionary, fond of telling people that societies grow like plants, not like explosions. That makes him infuriating to those who have already waited too long outside the polling booth. Yet he is also porous to competence, nothing persuades him like a job well done. He watches women organize wartime relief with precision, sees them balance municipal budgets better than blowhard councillors, and gradually the argument shifts inside him from whether to how. When the law extends the white women's franchise, it is not because he woke one morning enlightened, it is because the practical case had marched across his desk in an army of tidy columns and unstoppable testimonies. Icy, for her part, builds networks that make that new vote matter, quiet, faith-fueled, skilled, and as relentless as water through stone. The natural world keeps sauntering through this story because it kept sauntering through his life, hand in hand with the women who coaxed him back to scale. A day in the veldt with a botany tin is not escapism, it's calibration. He kneels, late in the afternoon, to look at a plant whose name he will write down in careful script, and you can feel the austerity of mind that big rooms sometimes loosen. Icy sends a boy after him with a sandwich and a sweater because the hydled night can turn sneaky cold. He thanks the lad, eats half, gives half to the dog, and tucks the sweater under his arm because, hey, he thinks he won't need it. He will need it. He will come in at dusk with hands stained green and a theory turning over in his head like boulders in a river, parts and wholes. Structure and life, the way a family, a farm, a federation might be understood if you looked with a botanist's patience instead of a general's impatience. Later he will turn that into sentences, earlier, Icy will turn it into supper, always, the two movements reinforce each other. Let's talk about the women you can't Google, because their anonymity is a scandal of its own. The cook who keeps the coal scuttle full and the bread from drying out. The nanny who knows each child's cries like a sequence of passwords. The laundry women whose hands carry the map of the household's rhythms, red and cracked and clever. They do not sit at the table to debate holism, they enact it, making a whole from parts the men in the big rooms never notice. When the union arrives at the gate, polite but resolved, asking for pay that honors the work, Icy is the one who meets them with her book open. She doesn't romanticize charity, she counts wages. Smuts is the one who tries to translate that encounter into policy, sometimes well, sometimes not. The women's verdict on him is not ideological, it is empirical. Does the money come on time? Can a child get milk? Is there dignity in the day? Those questions haunt him harder than hecklers in Parliament because they sound like his mother's and his wife's voices braided together. And yes, brew, there are temptations in capitals and hotels, whatever century you walk through. But the archives do not offer you a glittering scandal to paste on the wall. What they offer is a man whose temptation is abstraction, ideas so elegant they threaten to float away from the ground, and a set of women who sandbag those ideas with sacks of potatoes and shoelaces and statistics about how many blankets a winter eats. If you need seduction, try this, the seduction of neatness, of plans that look beautiful on a page. Icy breaks that spell with the most devastating pickup line in the South African domestic lexicon, how many cups of mealy meal is that? He blushes, metaphorically, if not physically, and revises. As the 1930s tilt into the 1940s, the home front becomes the front. ISIS committees hum like beehives. They pack parcels for soldiers with the kind of precision that defeats despair: socks, soap, a letter, taste of home. Each parcel is a stitched prayer. She knows which mothers can't write without crying and organizes a neighbor to do it for them. She knows which families won't ask for help and sets the church women on them with casseroles and accidental leftovers. Smuts, at a desk that has seen too many midnights, draws lines through terrible options until one looks fractionally less murderous than the others. He comes home for a night and sits, shoes off, on the stoop steps. She sits beside him. No big speeches. Two people who have learned to lean their tired against each other so it doesn't topple. One more scene, sharply cut, to carry us forward. It's after the war, but the peace is brittle. The National Party is gathering weather in its sails, and you can feel the pressure drop. In a hall somewhere on the reef, a meeting turns sour. Men shout the words that undo conversations: traitor, sellout, soft. Smuts stands, refuses anger the gift of his anger, speaks in that clipped, almost shy way that makes you lean forward to hear. A woman near the back, no hat, hair pinned up in haste, calls out, not to him but to the room, "Let him finish, man." The men settle, a little abashed. Later, outside, she shakes his hand like she's sealing a bargain and says, "You mustn't forget the price of bread." He nods, because the line lands like a psalm refrain, "You mustn't forget the price of bread." At Dawnclough that night, he repeats the story. Icy smiles, not unkindly. "You've always needed reminding," she says, and pours him tea. This is the cadence of their long alliance, thought tested by touch, policy chopped to kitchen size, ambition restrained by the radius of a home that insists on remaining human scale. If there were lovers drifting through, the record keeps their footprints light. If there were crushes in London drawing rooms, they evaporate like perfume in wind. What remains is a choreography of two stubborn people, each hard on themselves, sometimes hard on each other, who refuse to let the large drown the small. And the women beyond the house, the hophouses and shriners and the nameless legion of organizers, keep pressing the same point in different keys, that the test of a man's greatness is whether the women around him become more or less free. Here's your next hook, sharp as a thorn on a curry branch. Imagine a man who can shepherd a nation into a world war before lunch and by sundown, rewrite a paragraph that will echo in the founding papers of global peace, then stop mid-sentence because a woman at home has penned 6 calm lines that make him scrap the draft and start again. That's not romance, China, that's governance with a homestead's pulse. The rooms where he meets generals smell of cigars and ink, the rooms where he meets women smell of starch, paraffin, and the kind of bread that keeps a family from snapping. Between those rooms, Jan Smuts learns the most dangerous habit a powerful oak can pick up, letting reality talk back and noticing that it often wears an apron, a nurse's cap, or a travel-worn hat with pins from meetings nobody photographed. The war that made him a London heavyweight starts with a choice that splits the stoop in two. It's September 1939. Outside, the high-volt light has that brittle, polished look that makes everything feel newly minted and slightly fragile. Inside, telephones ring with a clipped English urgency that never learned to say, "How's it?" South Africa must side with Britain against Hitler, or fold into the warm, angry rhetoric of neutrality that masks an old resentment. Men shout in Parliament, some shout on street corners, a few shout with dynamite in their hands. In the kitchen, Icy needs bread and stills her temper by doing the next right thing: feed the household, clear the path for decisions. Remind the children that fear isn't a meal. When he comes home late, the windows at Dornkloof throw squares of lamplight onto the ground like promises. He finds her sorting letters from women, nurses in Kimberley asking for supplies, church groups in the Karoo offering blankets and an army of aprons, mothers who want to send sons to the front but are too proud to ask for travel money. He reads, sets his jaw, and says quietly, "We're in." She nods, and her nod contains an inventory: flour, soap, courage. From that night, the house becomes a logistics machine with a soul. The telephone table turns into a command post stitched together by women's voices. A teacher in Bloemfontein volunteers her sewing circle. A widow in Pietermaritzburg writes, "I have nothing but time and too good hands." A nun in Kimberley offers beds in a hospital wing that smells of disinfectant and devotion. People will later say Smuts took the country to war. The ledger would correct them: he took the country to work, and women, Icy at the center, scores of others in ever-widening rings, turned that work into endurance. The intrigue is not in a whispered tryst but in a chain of decisions so ordinary they hide their own audacity: who sits next to whom. At the church hall, whose pride is saved with a fiction: "These are surplus blankets, please help us use them." Which factory can be persuaded to switch from toffees to tin goods because a delegation of women arrived with ledgers balanced and eyes that don't blink? London again, the war cabinet chambers where carpets hush your steps and the air seems to hold its breath in case Winston strides in mid-sentence. Smuts speaks softly, the way a man does who expects sense to travel farther than volume. He argues for strategy with the patience of someone who has watched wheat grow and knows the tyranny of seasons. But nights in that city belong, oddly, to other rooms. He visits convalescent wards where nurses, women whose names never make the news, run empires of bedpans and morphine with a competence so absolute it looks like grace. He stands by a soldier who has lost more than blood and listens as a nurse steadies the moment with a hand to a shoulder and a tone you use when negotiating with pain. Later he writes to Icy, not about Churchill or maps, but about the astonishing ordinariness of courage in starched white, about how the nation's spine seems to be braided by women who apologize to no one for being necessary. The correspondence has another register too, the unmistakable echo of voices that once scolded him into seeing harder truths. Emily Hobhouse is long gone now, but her sentences still move in his head like a tide that undercuts bluster. Olive Schreiner's flame went out before this war, but her words, "Don't confuse prudence with fear," are an ember he carries in a pocket. Even in London salons, when someone coos about the romance of sacrifice, he hears a crackle of South African veldfire in Schreiner's refusal to sentimentalize pain, and he finds himself replying with the domesticated ferocity she taught him. "War isn't a language," he says to a duchess who has never queued for bread. "It's a set of shortages." The duchess laughs as if he's made a joke. He has not made a joke. He's thinking of kitchen tables where sums are done with crumbs and prayers. He's also thinking of constitutions, those recipes for the public kitchen. Between cabinet sessions and telegrams, he scratches at clauses and commas the way a farmer scratches at soil to test if it's ready. A strange thing happens: the more he swims in global waters, the more the currents run back to the stoop. Holism, his cherished idea that parts only make sense in the whole, stops being the tidy theory of a philosopher and becomes the messy practice of a house that must not drop any of its fragile pieces. Include the small ones, Icy writes in one note about relief distributions that also reads like a footnote to statecraft. Don't just count them. See them. That line follows him into rooms where men recite casualty numbers like rosaries. He fights to shape an international vocabulary that contains practical compassion, not just geopolitical geometry. Later, when he helps nudge language for a new world body into shape, you can hear Icy's domestic grammar ghosting the grand phrases. Kitchens, blankets, queues, dignity. A constitution that forgets its kitchen will bake only slogans. Back home, those kitchens are busy. Wartime South Africa is a tangle of unity and fracture, factories humming, mines booming, farm boys swallowed by barracks life, families gathering around wirelesses to hear news that pinches the heart. Women become the great translators of fear into action. They run canteens at stations, teach first aid, lobby councils for milk schemes, invent fundraising schemes that would make a banker blush. One Saturday in a church hall in Pretoria, a volunteer asks Icy, who is folding a stack of letters like a human franca, how to keep the widows from sinking into silence. Icy answers with a trick she learned before the war: give daring jobs to the shy ones. Make them treasurers. Tell them money likes quiet hands. Suddenly you have not just a committee, but a reason for a woman to get out of bed when grief says, stay. It's nothing like romance, this leadership, it's better. It's the art of making life slightly fairer by lunchtime. He is Prime Minister, J.A., but on some evenings he's just a husband trying to finish a sandwich before the next crisis. They find snatches of ordinary in the cracks between telegrams. She shows him a new method for stacking plates that saves time when a busload arrives unannounced. He demonstrates a pencil trick for working out supply ratios on a scrap of paper. Sleeves rolled, he slices bread too thick, she laughs and fixes it without ceremony. This is the choreography the cameras miss, big power moving through a kitchen like a river through reeds, slowed just enough to be human. Now, here's a scene with the kind of sparkle that gossip columns adore, except it refuses to misbehave for them. It is 1947, and South Africa is a stage under a royal spotlight. The young princess, bright-eyed, voice steady beyond her years, speaks words that will be quoted for decades. The crowd sways with pride and politics in equal measure. Offstage, Icy briefs the tea ladies like a field marshal: keep the urns full, don't forget the sugar for Auntie so-and-so who takes 2, make sure the Republican uncle is nowhere near the microphone. Smuts stands astride behind propriety, translating ceremony into belonging. Does the princess admire him? Almost certainly, he's the sort of elder who lends courage by just listening properly. Does he flirt? Not a stitch. He stands as a man who has been married, in every sense of the word, for half a century, to a wife, a homestead, a habit of service, and a suspicion of glamour. The intriguing exchange isn't a wink, it's a glance between husband and wife across a crowded room that says, as plain as weather, are the urns holding? Good. If you want the shocks in this period, brew, they are not in bedrooms, they are in ledgers. Wartime prosperity jacks up prices, post-war dislocation jacks up expectations, hunger and inflation bite at the same time, like two dogs on the same ankle. Women feel it first. They are the censors of the household economy, their fingers know instantly when a loaf is a fraction smaller than last week's. Letters to Dawnkloof thicken with this kind of intelligence. Sugar rations cut, we'll manage with jam if you can advocate for milk, writes a headmistress who has turned her school into a rationing academy. I can get men to argue in Parliament, Smuts says to Icy one night, but it's you lot who keep the peace in checkout lines. She raises an eyebrow, compliments are fine, but milk must still be found. There are darker rooms too, the ones where policy falls short, and the people who pay are women whose names the newspapers don't print. In townships and compounds, the war's uneven bounty throws ugly shadows: overcrowding, disease, wages that curl like burning paper. Once inflation touches them, relief committees, often led by women with church books in one hand and a battered ledger in the other, become thin dikes against a swelling sea. Smuts visits, takes notes, tries to translate the hard news of those rooms into a cabinet agenda. Sometimes he succeeds and money moves. Sometimes he fails and a silence settles on the car ride home like dust. He says little on those drives. Icy says less. They have learned that some griefs are more honestly met with stilled hands than with adjectives. The private weather in the house grows more precious as the public climate turns. The National Party rides a storm of resentment and the air crackles with slogans that make the skin tighten. The older man with the scholar's brow is outflanked by angrier poetry. A younger aide, sharp and clever, suggests a campaign appearance heavy on optics, flags, brass band, a stage-managed embrace of some celebrity. Smuts listens and then says, with that farmer's impatience for varnish, rather give me a hall with bad acoustics and 2 chairs. The hall fills. The acoustics are indeed bad. He speaks. Then a woman stands, a shopkeeper from a street nobody in London would recognize, and she tells a story about the price of paraffin. And the way riots start in kitchens. He doesn't interrupt with policy, he asks questions until the room can smell the problem. Later, in the car, he says, that was hard. Icy answers, hard is useful. Loss arrives in 1948 with the sharpness of a cracked plate. The vote, tallied across parishes and power stations and parlors, tips the country toward a narrower future. Cameras catch him wearing defeat like an old jacket, reluctant to toss it, unwilling to pretend it fits. Back at Dorncliffe, lamps bloom early against a sudden chill that isn't weather. The house, always a house of tasks, gets on with it. Tea is poured with a touch more sugar. The staff move quietly, protective of something fragile and decent. Visitors arrive balancing consolation and gossip. Icy filters them with that gentle gatekeeping that feels like hospitality but is actually strategy. In a private corner, he lets his shoulders sag. She lets him. Then she puts a notebook between them. Right, she says, businesslike, here's the list of people we must thank before Sunday. He laughs, because there is a kind of mercy in being reminded that gratitude is a task, not a mood. The marriage, at this point, has the relaxed competence of a seasoned orchestra that can sight-read grief. There are no grand conclusions scrawled across the sky. There is a way of eating supper that keeps despondency from growing too tall, a way of talking about the day that trims despair down. To problems, a way of sitting, 2 old people on a stoop, elbows almost touching, that steals dread's thunder by refusing to perform it. If a biographer comes begging for romance, the house gives him something better, fidelity to the unglamorous. The intrigue, if you still insist on the word, is that everything worth envying in this life happens in rooms no novelist would bother to describe. But for the women who peopled those rooms, Icy, yes, but also the volunteers and nurses and cooks and clerks, the rooms were the republic. And the man they steadied was useful precisely because they kept him scaled. The ghosts gather thickly as the decade closes, Hobhouse clear-eyed fury, Shriner's unfashionable prophecy, the choir of nameless. Women whose ingenuity kept an uneven country from splitting more often than it did. On some nights the old man goes out with a torch and checks the gate, a reflex older than Parliament's. He hears a jackal bark. He thinks of towns he will never again address, of queues he will never again shorten with a signature. He also thinks, because habit is destiny, of gardens that need tidying and of a chapter he might still add to that book of his, the one about wholes and parts and the stubborn kindness of systems that choose to hold. One more vivid picture to close this movement, a parcel room at a railway station, late war. Boxes everywhere, twine, labels, the dust of a long dry season. A girl, 18, perhaps, cheeks apple bright from purpose, argues gently with a clerk who is married to the ink pad. These parcels must go today, she says, because the ship goes tomorrow and a pair of socks does not carry itself across oceans. The clerk sighs the sigh of a man who is tired of everyone's emergencies. Then a tall figure steps in behind her, hat in his hand, voice mild. Let's assist the lady, hey? The clerk looks up, gulps, stamps. The girl turns, startled, then grins with the frankness of those who don't need or to be polite. Thank you, Menia, she says, but it wasn't for me, it was for the boys. He nods, because that is exactly the point, the work is never for the person doing it. He carries a box, feels the tug in old muscles that have known a rifle's weight, and thinks, this is the country, in miniature, a patient woman, a stubborn system, a small intervention, a goal that is someone else's comfort. He goes home and finds Icy has kept supper warm. Of course she has. She has been keeping things warm for half a century. The tension now is a different species, not battle drums but heartbeats, not the march of armies but the slow drum of endings. He structures his days with the same farmer stoicism that crafted his youth, lists, letters, small walks, attention paid where it adds up. She structures hers with the invisible cleverness of a person who knows where sorrow hides in a house and how to keep it from breeding. Their talk returns often, almost playfully, to first principles, the price of bread, what a constitution is for, whether a garden needs more shade or simply more patience. The grand gestures of public life recede, the gestures that matter more, hands steady in cups, notes written in a firm hand to an old adversary, a shawl fetched before the stoop turns chilly, come forward and take their rightful place as the real thing a life is built from. Here's your last hook, sharp as a wind off the Drakensberg and soft as dusk on the Highveld. Imagine a man who helped draft the bones of a world body meant to keep nations from biting each other, now sitting at a kitchen table tracing the rim of a chipped cup, listening to his wife read a letter from a nurse in a township clinic where the paraffins run out and a baby's breath sounds like a match about to die. One hand drew maps. The other hand, tonight, holds a cup steady so the tea doesn't slosh. This is how the story narrows, brew, from empire rooms to a room with a draft under the door, from global speeches to the exact pitch of a woman's voice when she is deciding how to tell the truth without breaking his heart. The cameras are gone. The intrigues that remain are not whispered trysts or smoky conspiracies but audits, of promises, of bread, of breath. If you stay with me, you'll hear how a marriage became a kind of weather system that softened hard seasons, how the women in his orbit, named and nameless, kept pushing his gaze from the clouds back to the vegetable garden, how, in the end, even a giant must put his boots by the door and learn to leave a house quietly. The late 1940s dialed the tension up without raising the volume. Defeat in 1948 didn't just take a job from him, it rearranged the house's acoustics. Sound carries differently when a title falls away. People call less, those who do call arrive with both sympathy and curiosity balanced on the same saucer. Icy manages the influx like a skillful usher at a packed church, a word here, a nod there, a refusal wrapped in kindness for the ones who come fishing for a quote to salt in somebody else's stew. He's resting, she says, which is true, and he's busy, which is also true, because the work of tidying one's public life, the papers, the letters, the half-finished arguments, is work all the same. The house takes him back like a Velt track takes a boot, uncomplaining, exacting. No more red dispatch boxes on the hall table. Instead, seed packets, envelopes of clippings, a manuscript bristling with penciled questions and a biscuit crumb or two fallen into the spine. He walks the fields and the aloe rows with a notebook. If you try see grandeur in the way he stoops to label a plant, the land itself will laugh you out the gate. It is just a man, older now, moving at human speed, letting a rhythm older than Parliament rewrite his pulse. And still the women's voices keep the beat, Icy with her lists, the committee ladies with their minutes and mercies, the nurses with numbers that pinch the conscience, the house staff with a rumor network that knows a shortage 2 days before the newspapers catch on. It is tempting to paint these years in sepia, but the scenes are high resolution. A day after the election loss, a messenger from the kitchen knocks the study door. Mears is asking if Menia will taste the soup, he says. It's the sort of line that would collapse under sentimentality if you didn't understand the grammar of this house. Taste the soup means, you are still useful, your mouth still matters, your verdict can still make something better before it leaves this room. He tastes. A pinch more salt, he says, and tell her the onions were brave today. Brave onions, China. It sounds like whimsy, but it's domestic theology, praise the parts that make the whole work. He reads letters and answers them in a tidy, slanted hand. From a widow, we lost our boy near Tobruk, your words at the station sent him off steady. He writes back without the anesthetic of platitudes. From a young teacher, my girls argue the price of bread is a political speech, am I wrong? He writes back, you are gloriously right, teach them to count. From a former adversary now ascendant, I hope you will accept the country's verdict with dignity. He writes back, I accept nothing that shrinks us, but I accept the arithmetic. May we both remember the price of paraffin. Icy reads these drafts, adds a comma where the breath needs space, removes an adjective if it glitters too much, and sometimes slips a small note under the inkstand, shorter is kinder. He obeys, because in a season when everything risks turning theatrical, economy is grace. You want a shocking image? Try this. The most important archive of his last years has grease stains on the bottom edge where fingers came straight from kitchen work to the page. The minute book of a women's relief circle in a dusty town arrives in the post, wrapped in newspaper, ribboned with blue wool. They cannot keep their records because they have no shelf that won't get damp. They ask, diffidently, whether Dorncliffe might. Icy sets a place for that book on a sideboard between a pot plant and a portrait. Smuts reads it like scripture. The entries are spare, surgical, or short. We improvise. Milk scheme approved after third attempt. Widow S thanked for blankets delivered by mistake. He laughs softly at that last one. He knows the code. When the state's purse strings knot, women learn to drop mercy by mistake. He writes to the chair lady with apologies for the ink blot where his pen slipped. Your minutes are a school for governments. Keep teaching. Old friendships return like winter birds. There are evenings with scientists who knew him in younger seasons, men who arrive with botany tins and leave with stories and a slice of milk tart wrapped in wax paper by Ice's instruction. There are letters from London that smell faintly of cigarette smoke and dust, from people who still call him General, or rank that. In this house now means, please fix the gate if you pass it. He answers with warmth and a hint of mischief. We managed to keep the aloes from sulking through the frost. He writes to a lord who only half remembers what frost feels like. Can the House of Lords say the same for itself? A joke, yes, but also an audit disguised as banter. The pressure outside the farm gate thickens. New laws march through Parliament with boots too heavy for a fragile floor. The women's networks, these quiet republics with treasurers who count cents as if each one were a small prayer, become early warning systems. They will cut the milk, one writes, simple as that. We will find a way to undo the loss, but it will cost us hours and shoes. Smuts drafts a letter to an old colleague sitting in a new chair. Please don't shave a child's breakfast to feed a grown man's politics. He doesn't send it. Not because he is afraid. Because Icy reads the draft and murmurs, you can do more good with 3 phone calls than with this letter. He calls. 3 small adjustments are made in offices that will never admit to softening. 3 dozen children drink milk next month who would have drunk water. There is no headline. There is, in the parlance of this household, a better soup. The body keeps its own book. He tires sooner. A morning's walk is still a morning's walk, but he sits a little longer on the stoop afterwards, head pushed back, eyes moving across the ridge like a plough. The laities who bring the post grow taller on him. One of them hands over letters with a new gravity because he has begun to see. In the grown-ups' faces, that envelopes can change a day's weather. Icy watches the edges of his strength with the same competence she applied to ration cards in a worse season. She introduces rests like a stage manager cues a lighting change. Come taste this, she says, and this is often a chair placed in shade. He pretends not to notice the choreography and plays along, because pride, too, can be educated. When pain walks into a room, it rarely kicks the door. It comes like a draft. There are afternoons when a headache refuses to be reasoned with, when a cough steals a sentence, when a step on the stoop misjudges. A riser and the heart jumps like a frog in a basin. He brushes it off with farmer's bravado. Icy does not brush, she adjusts. A shawl appears earlier in the evening. The soup is thicker. The lamp is moved so ink doesn't demand a squint. She loops the house around his weakening like a cardigan around a chilly child, matter-of-fact, and showy, precise. If you want a tableau to carry in your head, take this one. A storm is coming, the kind that blows straight across the veldt and slaps the windows like a debt collector. Inside, the kitchen runs on that storm's energy, pots cluck, the kettle boils with righteous intention, a boy is sent out to fetch. Wooden returns with hair in spikes and grin enormous. On the table, a parcel half-wrapped, the brown paper refusing to behave, the string having the kinked memory of string that has been used before. It's a care parcel for a woman in a far-off hospital, a stranger except that in this house strangers are rare species. Icy tucks in socks, a bar of soap, a small book with a pressed flower he collected years ago, a note that says, in a script that doesn't lie, you are not by yourself. Smuts adds a page torn from his own book, annotated with a line about holes and parts, and a postscript. The hole is each small mercy you endure through. He signs it, not with titles, but with a name that has learned its size, Jan. On some afternoons he goes into town, hat tilted, jacket sitting the way jackets sit on men who were once uniforms. People greet him with a blend of shyness and domesticated awe. A woman with a shopping basket stops him by the paraffin tins. Mania, she says, eyes bright with the courage that speaks out only when the weather of the day feels kind. They say history moves in big chunks, but my history is the price of this tin. He nods. So is mine, he says. That's why we used to argue about bread. She laughs, sad and satisfied, because she wanted to be taken seriously and was. He buys paraffin, a small triumph against darkness, and carries the tin to the car himself because there is a child watching who must not learn laziness from elders. The shadows lengthen. Friends leave, a few by choice, most by the ancient, unnegotiable exit. He writes notes to widows with a tenderness that avoids the potholes of consolation. When the kettle boils in an empty house, don't rush to quiet it, he writes to one. Let it sing a bit, for company. He and Icy invent rituals that keep the house from thinking too much about its own echo, a walk at the same hour, a poem read aloud from a book with a broken spine, a rule about not discussing politics after supper unless laughter is invited to interrupt every 7 minutes. They are not saints. They sulk sometimes, they bicker with the politeness of old fences, they rescue each other from sentences that were going to be unkind. But the choreography holds. Two people who have learned the trick of keeping a day in one piece perform the trick again and again until it looks like ordinary living. Now listen closely, Brew, because time, always the hidden drummer in this tale, changes tempo. A winter cough overstays. A fever tries to bluff, the house calls. Doctors come, sensible men who understand the rules here. Do not talk down to the woman who has already briefed you, do not waste metaphors on the man who has made a profession of them. They confer with Icy as with a colleague. Rest, they say, the dullest and most difficult prescription ever written. He resists because life hums in his hands when they hold a book or a plant or a problem. She enforces, kindly. Visitors are rationed like sugar in a bad year. Letters are answered with signatures that grow smaller as energy recedes. If there is panic in the house, it hides in practicalities, extra blankets aired, the bell polished so it can be run by a weakening hand without sticking, the garden cut back so winter winds don't waste strength on branches too tired to stand. A day comes when the study, keeper of storms and solaces, feels like a mountain. The bed is nearer, the chair kinder. He doesn't dress for breakfast, breakfast comes dressed for him, a tray with the tight ceremony of care, egg the color of late sun. Toast sternly buttered, tea with a lemon slice that looks like a small moon. He apologizes for the trouble. She gives him a look that says two things at once, nonsense, and you are worth it. He grins, contrite and pleased. You were always the general here, he murmurs. Only at the important war, she answers. Did the pasts come flooding? Not like a film reel, no. More like flashes, small and precise as veldt flowers after rain. A child's dusty feet on the farm at Weebeek West. The ache and rightness of riding through dawn to meet a commando whose eyes were older than their years. The smell of London fog and paper, and the way the world body's first drafts felt like spinning a web between mountain peaks. Olive's cutting voice, Emily's compassionate fire, the women in aprons who ran empires of sanity from church halls. A stoop. A bell. A farm dog sigh that could punctuate an argument with comic timing. These are not a hero's parade, they are the parts of a whole he keeps testing, even now. He dozes. She reads. The room learns a new quiet, the kind that fits around labored breath without pretending it's not there. From time to time he wakes with a question the way a farmer wakes at night to remember a gate. Did we thank Mrs. Williams for the knitted caps? He asks into the middle of a fevered afternoon. We did, Icy says, thinking of the note she sent with a line about how a good hat fixes a day. And the nurse in the township clinic? We sent soap, she says. and a lamp chimney. He relaxes. The gates, it seems, are closed. There is a story, almost too gentle to tell, about a final, stubborn gesture. One morning, weak as a reed, he asks for his boots. Everyone protests because boots can be heavy at the end of a road. He insists, with a shy smile, a man should know where his boots are. Icy brings them, polished as if for an inspection, leather a deep brown, the color of ground after rain. He doesn't put them on. He rests his hand on them. It is a sacrament without fuss. When he sleeps again, his hand has slipped to the blanket, but the shape of that resolve lingers in the room. The end comes the way ends do when a house has trained for them, not with keening drama, but with a widening of the quiet around a bed. A doctor checks a pulse he has known for years. It is a polite pulsing that is tired of being good. Icy leans close, the kind of closeness that drains the world of everything unnecessary. If there are last words, and people always hope for last words because we want tidy, let them be something like the ordinary sentence. He always loved, is the soup right? Maybe he says it. Maybe she says it. Maybe the soup, in a pot somewhere in the kitchen, answers with its own gentle ticking, right enough. After the bed is empty, the house does what good houses do, it gets on with the work of honor. Curtains are straightened. A shawl on a chair back is folded, not because anyone cares about tidiness now, but because carefulness is the language of grief here. The staff move with that deliberate quiet which says, we loved him by the way we worked for him. Women arrive with food, the old South African liturgy of casseroles and cakes that says what words stub their toes on. The bell is rung once, not for summons but for memory. The farm dog, confused by the world's rearrangement, lies down in the doorway and guards the absence because the absence feels like something that could be stolen. The nation does its larger mourning somewhere outside the gate. The newspapers attempt poetic arithmetic and mostly miss the point. Because the best lines were written for smaller rooms. Here are some of those lines, if you need them. A nurse who kept a note he wrote on a scrap of flimsy paper, now creased like a palm. A committee chair lady who tells her girls, we pack parcels this week in his name, and then again next week in our own. A clerk at a railway parcel room who stamps with a reverence he didn't know he owned. A woman with a shopping basket who says to her daughter. At the paraffin tins, that old man listened. These are the eulogies the house believes. Public speeches are for squares and statues. The stove's slow cluck is where truth warms itself. And Icy? She does not collapse into a theatrical widowhood because she never performed a theatrical wifehood. She moves through the house with the same competence that first made order out of ambition. She writes thank you notes as if each one were a small reconciliation the country needs. She sits sometimes on the stoop at the hour when he used to come back from a walk, and the air, remembering, does a little trick with light that makes a shadow where no one stands. She smiles at the trick. Grief is generous to those who notice gentleness, and speaks a line into the gallery of no one. Don't worry, I salted the soup. Then she goes inside because work, the old and honorable, is waiting. The women's chorus does not falter. The minute books keep thickening, the milk schemes keep navigating politics like canoes making for the far bank. The aprons wash, dry, and tie again. In official rooms, the new rulers congratulate themselves on order while forgetting that order is a kitchen discipline before it is a policy. The women remember. They make lists. They call each other by first names that carry the weight of millions: Anna, Thandi, Sarah, Aisha. They do not put flowers on ideology, they put bread on tables. If they think of the old oak at all, they think of him as a man who learned to listen to women who knew how many cups of mealy meal make a day hold. That is a legacy as practical as a cast iron pot, and it will outlast 5 manifestos. What of scandal, then, the brief you gave me at the start with its promise of wives, lovers, and intrigues? The wives are one, and the lovers are ideas. The intrigues are adjustments made in kitchens and committees and clinics where a woman's calm could tilt the day. There were no liaisons to turn into spicy anecdotes because this house saved its heat for kettles and arguments that mattered. There were, instead, exchanges of a different temperature, Olive's sentences, sharp as a new razor, Emily's facts, weighty as water. Icy's touch on a shoulder, lighter than a leaf and twice as directive. If you feel shortchanged by the lack of gossip, you've missed the richest piece of theatre in the country, a marriage that played 50 years to full houses of ordinary tasks, each night a tightrope act where the net was made of tea, lists, and truth. Picture the last scene I'll give you. It is neither funeral nor parade. It is a kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday some months later. A young committee woman arrives with a ledger under her arm and a problem. We can fund blankets or we can fund milk, we can't do both. The room, which has seen kings, receives her with the attention due to sovereignty. Icy turns the pages with fingers that have known ropes and ribbons, telegrams and teacups. She thinks a full minute, which in this house is a sacrament. Milk, she says. A blanket warms a night. Milk fortifies a future. The woman nods, writes the decision, and something durable is quietly born. That decision could sit in the margin of any constitution that intends kindness. Don't just fix the cold, feed the growth. So, my China, when you step back from this story and the credits roll in your head, don't imagine trumpets. Imagine a small bell. Imagine books with grease on their pages because hands didn't stop to wash before joining an argument. Imagine boots by a door. Imagine a pressed flower forgotten inside a volume that once traveled in a parcel to a hospital bed. Imagine women who ran the country's conscience from the side rooms and corridors and vestibules. And imagine a man who learned, by long apprenticeship to such women, that the only intrigues worth paying for are those that turn abstractions into suppers and speeches into milk for a child. If you must carry one line out into your own weather, carry this one, the house's unspoken motto: you mustn't forget the price of bread. It will keep your politics human, your love honest, and your ambition scaled to people who eat. Jan Smuts, barefoot scholar turned general turned farmer again, learned it at a woman's table and tried, with mixed success and stubborn sincerity, to spend the rest of his days budgeting for it. The women, his wife, his critics, his co-workers in aprons, kept the account open. That's the real romance. That's the only intrigue that doesn't sour.